Now, for a while now, I've actually had a couple of running issues or idling issues with the XJ40. So I decided to take the bull by the horns and try and sort out this particular issue. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was to actually get the injector spray bar out of the way. Now, you have to get this out of the way if you want to replace the fuel pressure regulator. So, starting off, I basically removed all the connectors from the injectors, and then you've got these four 8mm bolts which hold the rail in place. Once those are removed, the rail is pretty much loose and can be pulled out, but you've got the fuel supply pipe, which you can see there on the left hand side. It's the one sort of going into closest to the bulkhead. You can sort of see the dome shaped thing on top of it. That's the fuel supply rail, or the fuel supply itself. Now, you will find that because the tank is at the back of the car and it's in the boot, there's enough pressure in the tank, especially when you've got a lot of fuel in there. There is actually enough pressure to push the fuel out without having the pump in place. So I use one of these little clamps that you can see there. It's actually a laser tools clamp, and I use one over on the other side, just after the fuel pressure regulator. So to get everything else out, I found these little connectors on the injectors, which I sort of just prized off. You don't strictly need to remove those before pulling the fuel rail off, but I did anyway. In fact, it's probably advisable to leave them on so that the injectors come out with the rail itself. Now you can see that these injectors have got an O-ring on the very tip. There's also another O-ring inside the injector where it goes into, or at the back of the injector rather, where it goes into the fuel rail. So you can see here I'm just pulling each one out in turn and just inspecting the injector, inspecting the O-ring, which in each case was actually, believe it or not, actually reusable. I was quite surprised. I thought the O-rings would be absolutely destroyed, but they were still sort of pretty pliant and soft, so I left them in place because I didn't have suitable replacements. But I used a bit of carb cleaner to remove all of the sort of built up carbon on the tip of each injector. Now, what you could do at this point is you could send the injectors off to have them ultrasonically cleaned. But because I didn't want to do this, or rather I didn't think it was necessary at this point, I chose a slightly different method. So you can buy these tools which test the injectors. They basically test the injectors by pulsing them a number of times, or they can pulse them on a continuous basis. So I set my injector pulser to continuous, and the injector pulser itself actually came with a couple of adapters that you can see there. So using a battery which I had to hand. Now ideally you would have another connector that fits the injector. I just made do by putting those two spade connectors from the tool itself, or the pulsing tool itself, just into the injector, and then just bridging the positive onto the injector until it actually cycled. You can sort of just see it there cycling. You pop it on top of the can of carb spray, which you can see me doing there. And then once you've got it pulsing, so you can see I've just working it around to get it pulsing. Once it's pulsing, you quite literally just press down to release some of the carb cleaner there, and it shoots it out the end of the injector. You can sort of tell by the sort of pattern that was coming out that the nozzle itself didn't seem to be blocked, to be honest with you. So I don't think I need to send those off for sort of any further cleaning. Once I've done that, just disconnected it and then popped it back into the rail. Now, so that I didn't mix up injectors, I did one at a time, and when completing, or obviously when finishing one of the injectors, I would then just put it back into the rail so that each injector stays, or rather is going to be staying with the same cylinder. I don't think there would be an issue mixing them up, but you don't want to introduce any potential randomness into the fault fixing process. It's just easier just to keep everything in the one place. So this actually worked rather well. The next time I will probably repurpose a connector. So try and get a connector off a scrap car or something along those lines. To be honest, fuel injectors around this era are pretty much the same. So any car that has multi-point fuel injection from this sort of era into the 90s probably has those same sort of style connectors on the injectors. I think, to be honest with you, my K11 Micro, which is from 2000, has got the same type of connector. Now, what I did now as well was started off with cleaning. As you could see there, I was just spraying some carb cleaner into the open ports and just letting it sit in there to sort of get rid of anything on the back of the valves. To be honest, because you've got petrol being sprayed onto the back of the valves, it's unlikely you'll have many deposits on the inlet valves. So it's really just sort of just to clean the point where the injectors go into the manifold. So I had to remove the cruise control actuator pipe. So from the actuator pump at the front left of the car, I had to remove the pipe just so I could get the new fuel pressure regulator in place. Now the pressure regulator is on this bracket. It's a bloody flimsy bracket, to be honest, so you need to be a little bit careful when removing the 22mm nut that sits between the bracket and the regulator. The new regulator pretty much just goes in the same way, but, and this is sort of like a double-edged sword with the bracket, or rather, actually not a double-edged sword, because this is a positive aspect of this bracket. Because the bracket is so flexible, you can, so long as you leave the two 8mm bolts loose and you leave that 22mm bolt loose, nut loose, you can get it into a position where it will reconnect to that fuel bar, as you can see there, and that's a 17mm nut holding that into the fuel pressure regulator. It's 17mm on both sides with the large 22 lock nut when you lock it up against the bracket. You'll notice on the right hand side the inlet portion, that again is a 17mm nut for the inlet pipe. That pipe going into the fuel pressure regulator over on the left there, that was also clamped before complete removal. Because there's still fuel in the tank and there's still enough pressure to push fuel out. It then takes a little bit of lining up to get the fuel bar back in place, and then you've got your four 8mm bolts that you need to put back in, and the end result, once you've got the battery hooked up, is, just wait, pretty impressive actually. The idle is now a lot smoother than it was previously. There is when the temperature gets up, when it gets up to temperature, there is still a bit of wobbliness at idle, which I think can be corrected by a new throttle position sensor, which is on the underside of the throttle butterfly. So I need to get to that from underneath. So that's going to be the next thing that I'm going to replace. But the rest of it seems to be operating far better than it was previously. It's idling a lot smoother, it's hunting a lot less, it's really just sort of doing what it should do. Now, the one thing about the 3.6 is, even though it is a smooth straight 6, for a straight 6 it's ever so slightly rough, and it was one of the criticisms that was levelled against the 3.6 when it was new, especially when it first saw service in the XJS in 1983. There were revisions before the XJ40 was released in 86, which did make it a lot smoother, but certainly the AJ6 was not a really smooth engine until the 4 litre and 3.2 versions. You could argue that the 3.2 is actually the smoothest of the lot because of that shorter stroke. Now, when the engine is running and you have revved it a few times to increase the fuel pressure in that rail, you just want to make sure that all of those unions and bolts and connections are not leaking, especially around the injectors. If the injector is leaking, you'll probably just need to take the spray bar off again and actually replace all of the O-rings. Thankfully, mine was actually okay. It was okay at the regulator, it was also okay at all of the connections, so it was doing exactly what it should. The other thing that I did as well, because I wanted to check if there were any vacuum leaks, certainly around the point where the injectors went into the engine, was I sprayed some carb cleaner, basically just around sort of various points around the inlet manifold, just to check that there was no sort of decrease in RPM or increase in RPM. I can't remember which way it is. I know brake cleaner increases RPM if you spray it and there's a vacuum leak. I think it's something like hairspray decreases the RPM. So there was no change in RPM either up or down when I was spraying the carb cleaner around the inlet manifold, which is a pretty good indication that there are no vacuum leaks or anything of that nature. And that was that, actually. That was... how long did that take? Job take that. Took a couple of hours to do the whole lot. Would have been made a lot shorter if I had had a individual connector for each injector, so I could just got that done a lot quicker. I wasted quite a bit of time there getting the two connectors that I had to connect onto the pulsing device, but yeah, that would have made it a lot quicker. But apart from that, I'd say it was a job well done, to be honest with you. And that concludes this video. So hopefully, if you have XJ40 running problems, this may help you. It's certainly a good bit of routine servicing, especially after 35 years. That is worth doing. That fuel pressure regulator, definitely worth replacing. That's, I think, was probably the reason why it's running a lot better now, because there's a more constant pressurization in the fuel rail. The other thing I noticed, when I was releasing pressure from the fuel rail, there was no pressure in the fuel rail at all. The car hadn't been started for quite a while, so that could be the reason why, but you would expect there to be some residual pressure left, but then again, I suppose not necessarily. Anyway, that concludes this video. If you have found this interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care, and thanks for watching.